Manya and Patricia, I'm so excited to have you here to talk about your new book. It is an amazing accomplishment. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having us, Vanessa.
Thank you, Vanessa. It's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to meet again and talk about this new book.
Yeah, so how would you like to start? Do you want to talk about how the book came to be or?
Well, we were going to start by talking about love, because everything comes to be when we talk about love, right? That's how things come to be. We were originally going to do this on Valentine's Day, and for reasons we couldn't. So we were. Now it's a kind of pretend Valentine's Day. So we're going to have, and which pretends has to do with love as well. So we're going to start with that idea in our book.
And
Patricia?
also the temporality that maybe the unconscious doesn't know about chronological time. It's a
Doesn't know
logical
about
time of the
Valentine's.
unconscious. So every day can be Valentine's
Valentine's Day,
Day. So
right?
that on
Or
that spirit.
with that spirit, it's never Valentine's Day.
Exactly. Oh, that's it. We could declare that no day will ever be Valentine's Day.
Right. Right. And the idea, well, if the woman does not exist and the other does not exist and the sexual relation does not exist, wait, but yet there's still Valentine's Day. And that's why we're going to start with love. Right. So we were going to start with, because of the Valentine's Day idea, we were going to start with thinking about love, because we're going to think about love, gender, sexuality, and psychoanalysis. Patricia, do you want to start?
Yes,
Okay.
our point of departure to a little discussion on the theme of love, which is one of the issues approaching in this book that puts psychoanalysis in dialogue with other disciplines. It's a very interdisciplinary book, and what we try to do is to introduce a conversation, which I think is whenever one starts thinking about love, words are needed, conversations open up in the context of certain statements that circulate around psychoanalysis. One could be Lacan's dictum, there is not such a thing as a sexual relation, that the sexual relation does not exist. And perhaps, even though people may have sex, encounters between bodies may occur, perhaps we need love to make that inexistence more tolerable. And one thing that is important to keep in mind when we're talking about love, what do psychoanalysts talk about when they talk about love, is that love concerns the very being of the other, that in love we are not limited to the narcissistic trappings of image. If we take the metaphor of Plato's cave's walls, we accept the love other in their being. We love them as they are. And we may say that there is always, of course, a release of tension achieved by the sexual act. This discharge evokes emptiness and is expressed by Galen's famous phrase, post coitum omne animalu triste est, that after the sexual union, the human animal is sad. And that loving tenderness after sex would engage the other person's subjectivity, because it's addressed to the other being, that we could say that in this post-sex embrace, the discrepancy of the meeting of the bodies is unceremoniously unmasked. One's arm falls asleep, one foot cramps, one is unable to sleep, troubled by the snoring of the other. That when tolerated, love not only makes up for these unavoidable awkward moments, but is not perturbed by the disappointment, the negativity encountered at the core of sex. I don't know, Manya, if you would like to add something.
Do we want to go on to discuss sexuality versus identity in the
But
love?
maybe
I
add
was
a
going to
few
ask you,
words.
what do you think is the difference between transference and love?
Well, there wouldn't be any difference because, as we know, often transference is addressed through the axis of love. But love understood in a very peculiar way, the way that Lacan offers an original reading of transference is no love in the sense of a sort of replica of an early love attachment. You will love your analyst as you love your mother, or hate your analyst as you felt hated by your dad. It's not a sort of reproduction. It's not Xeroxing early relationships, but rather is an unavoidable consequence of a supposition of a knowledge that would be the basis, the starting point that hopefully would get the treatment started, and a position of being the loved one, the one to whom a certain knowledge is ascribed, and hopefully that person, the analyst, would fall from that position and become more of an object cause of desire, and eventually being let go of that. If we think that an analysis is the start, a medium, and leads to an ending, that has to be considered from the very start. Otherwise, we could not get the treatment started if we are not aware that it has to end. Then the analyst will fall from that transferential position, that ascription of knowledge, to be fulfilling the destiny of any object A, which is to let it fall, let it go off.
And maybe there's a distinction between the way we attribute the object A to the lover, a distinction to be made. And see, in the analysis, it allows us to think. It allows the unconscious to produce and develop and make what Lacan will call the formations of the unconscious in the treatment, whether it's new symptoms, new developments of the symptom. Whereas the idea in the other, they're kind of sustaining a fantasy, which has a sense of stasis in it, which the analysis allows to move. So that would be a kind of distinction between the two.
But also add that it's not specific to the analytic encounter. Probably anyone who teaches has encountered transference, and I think good teachers make productive use of that transferential bond. That in any situation where there is an ascription of a supposition of knowledge or a supposition of a subject of knowledge, there will be transference. But as Manya was saying, that the advantage you have is that the setup of analysis would provide with a frame to overcome that fantasy and give to the analyst probably more agency at the end of the process of analysis in regards to this transferential bond.
Or we could also say, like, it makes if the object falls, it makes desire.
Makes room for desire. Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. I don't know how much room for desire is nowadays in classrooms, but at that,
even in analysis, right? Even in analysis,
even in analysis. Yeah. Well, that's, I think, maybe one of the objectives of the collection, to make room for desire to flow, to create desiring connections, to create more desire to learn, to know, to push ideas further. And also we use the expression in introduction, a cross-pollination between fields. It's not that psychoanalysis would apply an expertise on fields that lack it, but rather the possibility of an exchange between different forms of production of knowledge, right, and truth as well. Yeah.
To put like feminism, trans discourse, gender studies, psychoanalysis, and make them all like in the same room and make in the same book and make them all talk to each other. Right? Something like that, right? And to have that conversation. They're already in the book shows how much those discourses are already informed by each other. The introduction has a long historical passage where we really do the footwork to show the building of how different discourses influenced each other over time. And so that one might think, for example, if one, maybe one is not so aware of how much there has been a cross-pollination of these discourses, and they should not be like antagonistic, because they're actually made of each other. So that's one of the things that the book helps both show and then produce in the various chapters that we have.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just going to say how amazing the introduction is and that kind of history that you walk the reader through. It's really fantastic.
Yeah,
Thanks.
yeah, that in a way there is a combination that maybe even though there are differences between the discourses,
Right.
there is a lot of productive, maybe confrontation, and one thing that it is obvious today that we cannot talk about sex, gender, sexuality without, even if we, for somebody who may hate psychoanalysis and want to debunk his theories, nevertheless, even in colloquial use, we cannot address sex, gender, sexuality without using a psychoanalytic vocabulary. And this connection is not just a coincidence. There is a foundational connection that dates back to the early days of psychoanalysis.
That we show in,
So, yeah, we show in the book, and yeah.
and some of the essays work on as well. So
Yeah,
it's
but
not
maybe
just
we could do that, Manya. What do you think about perhaps sharing with you, with whoever is still listening to this podcast, to tell you a little more about what is the book? Because the book is a wonderful book. We are very proud of it. Thanks to the amazing contributions we have,
contributors.
we managed to bring together a very rich combination of contributors, and a big thank you to all the authors that had made the book possible, and we were really honored and blessed with having amazing contributions, very strong chapter that and were able to confirm this initiative that we had. So maybe we could go rapidly through, tell you what is the book about, but simply mentioning what the chapters are about.
Well,
What do you think about that?
yeah, that's a good idea. Let's do that.
So we were talking precisely about the object A and what causes desire, and we are by definition speaking being structurally lacking, but that lack is salutatory, right? That in a way the fact that we are lacking allows for desire to exist, and one important thing to keep in mind is that that object that causes desire is an object that if we go back to Freud proposed in the 3 essays that the object of desire is contingent. The only object of the drive is satisfaction. That would propose that the object of the drive is ungender. And in a way, we see already in the early days of psychoanalysis, I'm talking about the 3 essays, 1905, we have the possibility of a type of reading of psychoanalysis that holds a lot of future for any further theorization in gender studies and sexuality, because it is democratic, it is ungender, it is not heterosexist, and it is not normative. And this is something that we could also see in Lacan's rereading of Freud, that the notion of Lacan of the object A has indeed a lot of promise in terms of not being determined by gender.
Right. In that sense, like if I'm thinking about the first chapter in the book, right? That it's
Yes.
not even if we're talking about, like, even if we touch just briefly on gender pronouns, right? There's the famous they, right? And the question of who, right? Who are we going to bed with? Let's stay on our love and sex idea, right? And our very exciting, we both think it is, first essay by Tim Dean is called Freud's Ménage à Quatre, right? And through this, he thinks about it's looking back to Freud's idea of like how many people are in bed, right? And the essay thinks through the difficulty of sex, challenging and dispelling certain of our assumptions about it. First, like the obvious one that would be people wouldn't think twice about, that there are only 2 people in bed, right? And so maybe so each idea, there are only two people in bed. What is sex? All of those get to be rethought in Dean's essay. So maybe our confidence in when we think we know what we're talking about regarding sex, or even how many people are in bed, is a kind of ruse that like allows us to think we know what we're talking about. Because the idea is like, Freud had mentioned that there are at least 4 people in bed, right? And as we who are we having sex with? Who's there? So he will work through that in that essay in a really delightful and very witty and very clever and very revealing way.
Yes, simple arithmetic doesn't work in terms of sexuality. In a coupling of 2, we have, according to Freud, at least 4 people, and we may see, if we follow Freud's idea of sexuality being polymorphous, we have already a conceptual impossibility of maintaining any binary category, any conception, all other assumptions, heteronormative assumptions about sex, or even the certitude of what is sex about without any gender prescription, need to be rethought and questioned, and rethink our prescriptions and descriptions about sex as at least symptomatic. That in a way, what this first chapter by Tim Dean is to put those enigmas at the heart of sex into a productive, exploiting the contradictions. And I won't say more. I will leave you with intrigue. Read it, because it's interesting. It's a wonderful antidote to all this bombardment we have every day, from self-help books to the Kama Sutra, that the assumption is if we could only do it right, sex would not be a problem. And already the history of psychoanalysis derives from problems, symptoms for which medicine could not offer any answer, that had at the core, according to Freud, a sexual origin. And the talking cure, psychoanalysis, was invented by addressing this mysterious link between psyche and body, and through the hysterical body in pain and suffering, that reveal more fidelity to language than to anatomy, and a body that could be cured, relief of pain, by the effect of words. And here we would lead to what is our second chapter in the collection, Glossa and Counterweight, the perverse tongue of psychoanalysis. And I would leave it to Manya to describe Elisa Marder's wonderful second chapter in our collection.
Elisa Marder does a kind of counter reading of one of the pre-psychoanalytic case studies of Freud, revealing a non-binary conception of gender and sexuality that actually traverses Freud's oeuvre. And it's a certain close reading of Freud. In the 1880s, Freud became fascinated with the case of a woman who interrupted her own speech by making strange bird-like noises with her tongue. So Marder looks at this scene of fixation of the tongue to detect a countercurrent to how Freud is often read as like heteronormative views about gender and sexuality, that the work of language as stage in a hysterical body actually influenced some of Freud's most obscure formations regarding how a woman comes into being, female sexuality, perversion, and fixation in his later writings. Feminism questioned and reinvented the notion of what a woman is, or as Freud asked earlier, how it is that a woman comes to be, bringing this process to critical discussion. It's a really fabulous reading about language and the body in its hysteria, which is fundamentally non-binary, and that's why it's like it has a place in our book. It's a kind of re-looking at Freud, and it takes us to the third essay, which is it's Darian's right contribution to the
Yeah,
book.
Darien Leaders.
Right. Right, on the gender question from Freud to Lacan. And it's a extremely scholarly, close reading of the contributions of the 20s and 30s that bring an often overlooked debate to life, where Leader is recontextualizing the castration complex that had been accepted by all of Freud's circle and showing it how it had led to controversies. And one of the developments of that controversy was penis envy. But it was not accepted, that idea, by all of Freud's circle. An outcome of this debate in Lacanian theory would be the transformation of the penis as organ into the phallus as symbol or signifier.
I think we see in the chapters a certain common feature. Earlier on, Manya was referring to Freud having already presenting the question: how does a woman come into be? Why does a woman? Why is she supposed to end up loving a man and not her mother? That is something that then was revisited by Simone de Beauvoir when she asked the question: the woman it becomes, well, if she has to become a woman, it's not a given. And we see there that there is an implicit dialogue. Even we know that Simone de Beauvoir took distance from psychoanalysis, a critique that was probably addressed to the psychoanalysis contemporary to her work, with objections that we share. And we see that it's important to do this close reading to see that there is we may be holding assumptions that are not really founded in historical facts. And I think this is one of the great contributions of Leader by for instance, giving us material to then return to very recent theorizations in the Lacanian field, because, for instance, he will revisit the sexuation formula that in some readings could perpetuate a normative paradigm of sexual difference and could end up reinforcing a binary. And in this sense, the chapter by Leader contributes this informed perspective on how to maybe rethink not early contributions to complex notions like penis envy and so on, but also much more recent theoretical developments in the field of gender and sexuality. And that's how we find our fourth chapter in the collection that also continues looking at foundational psychoanalytic texts with a sort of original reading to rediscover the contribution that these theorizations have and that are still relevant today. And this is how in chapter 4 we have to analyze as what is genitality, Ferenczi Thalassa, and Lacan's Lamela. And this is the contribution of Jameson Webster and Marcus Coelen that again would recontextualize controversies of the half-first of the 20th century, revisiting Sandor's Ferenczi's notion of thalassa. And they offer in this chapter a very original concept of libido that is thought in conjunction with Lacan's myth of the lamella, this originary, undead, libidinous, inorganic organ of differentiation. And they managed to unpack the pre-Oedipal origin of difference. They offer a juxtaposition that leads to a reassessment of the very controversial and very contested notion of the phallus. And they see how we can maybe through their contribution have elements to revisit the notion of the phallus, not just in the psychoanalytic context, but also through the contributions by contemporary feminist theory and queer theory as well. And what we can see, thanks to the contribution of Coelen and Webster, is that we could use the concept of the phallus in a way that will no longer be an outdated misogynistic relic, but that could acquire clinical relevance in the practice today, and they give us tools to rethink the notion of the phallus in relation to questions of sexual difference, family romance, and the impasse that sexual relations bring about, and also addressing them in the analytic transference. To go back to Vanessa's questions about transference, we could maybe rethink the concept of the phallus in connection with analytic transference. So maybe we then could, in conclusion to their article, start thinking productively in terms of not so much the phallus. They work with the notion of agalma as this unremarkable object concealed, this unappealing or unremarkable object concealed beneath an exterior that could be deceiving about its value.
And so this kind of agalma becomes fallen. We're talking about the thing that can fall in analysis. We were discussing earlier what the idea of transference, right? And so that brings us into our, so we kind of, it's a dinner, you know, it's like all beautifully laid out, right? So this brings us into our next chapter, that this loss can have a signifying function, right? And for psychoanalysis, identity, whether it's sexual is or otherwise, is aleatory. And it's constructed around an inaugural loss. And it can be traced to this kind of mythos that Jameson and Webster and Colin's article discusses. A mythical ungendered moment when we fell from an undifferentiated completeness into a fractured and as we sexuated reality. This question of interpolation, right, to become interpolated into the symbolic order, is what the next essay will touch on, how we're interpolated, boy or girl. Judith Butler famously developed the role of Althusser's notion of interpolation, quote, the material ritual practice of ideological recognition in everyday life, in their discussion of the social construction of gender identities. Althusser's idea underlines both the embodied material and the symbolic ritual or linguistic components of interpolation. We are hailed, we're summoned as gendered subjects. How can I claim my name? How am I claimed by it? How am I claimed by notions of identity that claim me, right? So this is in that Althusserian discussion and is addressed in Genevieve Morel's, our next chapter, Undoing the Interpolation of Gender and the Ideologies of Sex. She returns to Althusser's theory of interpolation, adding the valence of the unconscious to Butler's analysis, in light of the fact that the subject of ideology is also the psychoanalytic subject of the unconscious. She shows how gendering interpolations can be sometimes injurious when they're either normative or non-normative, and they are interpreted through unconscious fantasy. Making use of her experience as a clinician, she discusses how subjective transformation can undo the deleterious effect of slurs that people have been interpolated by, and granting new possibilities of identification beyond that. She really magnificently analyzes Guillaume Gallien's 2013 film Me, Myself, and Mom, or in French, Les Garçons et Guillaume à table, which is a story of a boy in an upper-class family who's considered gay, and he has to kind of come out as straight, and it's very amusing, and she does a beautiful reading of it that I won't go into because the essay is fantastic, touching on this question of gender and interpolation in the social order.
Also, to maybe harken back to what we were discussing before, the potential of analysis of allowing what Lacan describes as a little bit of freedom, which is still freedom, even though it maybe is just a little bit of traversing one's own fantasy. That we are working in the collection on seeing how at times identity may not overlap with what we think identity is, how subjective truth may not correspond, or the subjective experience, to what is constructed as the identity of that subject. And in this case, analyzed by Genevieve Morel, is how psychoanalysis could grant a space where one could undo the identifications that led to a formation of identity through the projection of fantasy. And the next 3 chapters in the collection will address the issue of fantasy, of course, from the psychoanalytic perspective. The notion of fantasy in psychoanalysis is very different from how popular culture would consider fantasy. If we think of how Freud systematized the notion of fantasy, he proposes a sentence, a formula, when he writes in A Child is Being Beaten. He reduces the notion of fantasy to a single sentence of what Lacan would call an axiom, something like a mathematical formula that is a primer that would give meaning to someone's history, would create a space for a temporality, would introduce the dimension of time, as well as granting a place for a subject in it. And in fact, what we soon discover in an analytic cure, and this is presented by Lacan, the fantasy is nothing but a veil. If we think of the Wizard of Oz, behind the curtain, there's nothing. So it is a veil over a nothing that is at the origin of signification.
Wait, Patricia.
Yes.
There's a man behind the curtain, but he's not the great and powerful Oz. Let's just remember. Let's be true.
There is a man, but you cover the. But isn't that a disembodied voice? There is somebody talking. You cover the curtain, and there is no. It's not a huge power as we construct
right.
it.
It's just
he's not a wizard. He's a trickster.
He's a jerk from Kansas. Exactly.
Exactly. Yeah, after this outcome of the Super Bowl in Philadelphia, we don't talk about Kansas. But okay, so this is the second section of the book, Queering Psychoanalysis, Fantasy, Anthropology, and Libidinal Economy. This second section follows the part one, which is a genealogy of sex and gender, where we explore through fantasy, anthropology, and libidinal economy how we create this window, fantasy as a window that allow us to frame the world. And the first chapter in this second section is by Ebb Watson, and the role of fantasy in representations and practices of homosexuality, Com Tolvin's The Blackwater Lightship, and Edmund Wise, Our Young Men. Manya, I'll let you if you want to say a few words about that section.
So Watson is looking at queer narratives of desire, and to look at the possibilities of fantasy beyond systems of normalization and normativization and domination. So the function of fantasy has been elided in contemporary queer and critical theories of desire, except for some exceptions. And Watson is trying to show that the nothing of fantasy can function as actually a prerequisite for desire in order to stay on the side of life. So we can sometimes think of that nothing as something like in Melancholia, but here it becomes productive. It becomes a way of the nothing doesn't have to be melancholic or paranoiac, right? It can be an empty hole that propels us towards the world and to other subjects. So it's a kind of extended through those literary texts. There's those queer literary texts. There's an extended understanding of fantasy as an unconscious support that organizes subjective desire, and concomitant with the role it plays in culture. And in the essay, maybe the idea that it doesn't have to buttress political, ideological, or economic ends, or programs, or sexual mandates. So she argues that in terms of fantasy, the way a fantasy of homosexuality has been in normative discourse, a kind of placeholder for excess, for otherness, for dis-ease, and for loss. And she looks at these writers as ways of undoing that fixity. Similarly,
which is that's what the next chapter does. Yes, exactly.
Go ahead.
Exploring the phantasmatic relevance of the figure of the homosexual as a sort of nexus of cultural excess. The idea of homosexuality in Western contemporary culture as a placeholder for excess, otherness, disease, loss. And I'm referring to the next chapter, that's Ray O'Neill, chapter 7. Yep.
On Oscar
Yeah.
Wilde.
I'll let you, yes.
Ray O'Neill talks about Oscar Wilde's comedy in art and tragedy in life in light of the unconscious transmission of trauma. You know, Freud was born 2 years after Wilde. It's like just two worlds we don't often put together. And he's thinking through generational trauma in Wilde's life and what makes Wilde, right? O'Neill shows the primacy of unconscious repetition in Wilde's life, unearthing transgenerational, and it's quite interesting because there's a lot of history in the essay about the Wilde family. So transgenerational unconscious transmission of fantasy, desire, and anxiety, and exploring this in the relationship of repetition and transgression for Oscar Wilde. And it shows how historically overdetermines sexuality and filiation and it can be. And discuss it and also thinks about the question of the Oedipus structure in transmission, which takes us into our next chapter. Patricia?
Yes, that would be chapter
8,
which is the chapter by Monique David Menard. Does the anthropology of kinship talk about sex? And we were talking about Oedipal structure, but also we are talking implicitly about structures of kinship, and here we are making a reference to the work of the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss. And what Monique David Menard does in her essay is work with the question, is asking whether foregrounding sexuality in psychoanalysis would have an equivalent in the anthropological analysis of the kinship structure. And he moves away from corporeal coordinates to symbolic coordinates and examines the use of categories of sex and sexual difference in the field of anthropology. David Menard wonders whether anthropological inquiry provides other modalities of separation from the incestuous bond with an all-powerful maternal figure, in addition to what psychoanalysts call symbolic castration. This is a prescription for a good outcome in psychoanalysis. And that's an exploration of anthropological studies of menstruation, menopause, and infertility that overlap with psychoanalytic constructions about sexual difference.
Mm-hmm.
This is a very important chapter in our collection, in which we can move from the model proposed by psychoanalysis to think about sexual difference to what we can learn from what is explored in the field of anthropology, that could show us that how important it is, this sort of cross-cultural approach. For instance, we see that there are other cultures that have managed to come up with ways of incorporating in their social fabric non-binary gender identities. And here, for instance, we have the example of Native American Two-Spirit, an umbrella term for the combination of what is considered male and female energy, that there are other forms besides those proposed by Western culture to construct what is considered natural or normal, and how it's important to add a consideration of non-binary forms of construction of being in the world, and of forms of social organizations that could allow for other forms of expression of subjectivity. That in a way what they are showing is that even social organization is a form of fantasy. It's constructed, it is contingent, and that in that sense we can use psychoanalytic tools, if we think of the theory of fantasy, the theory of subjectivity, as having an emancipatory potential to challenge gender oppression. That's how we move to the next chapter in the collection, that we could say that the gender revolution had been brewing for several decades and has perhaps come to a boiling point. That psychoanalytic theory can perhaps help account for. And this is how we come to the chapter by Kelly Oliver, From Fundamentalism to Forgiveness, Sex, Gender, Beyond Determinism or Voluntarism. And in this chapter, Kelly Oliver voices a very sharp and intelligent critique of the constant bombardment of violent reactions that seem to have become the norm. So maybe Manya, you want to add to this?
Well, she's wondering. It's called the chapter is From Fundamentalism to Forgiveness: Sex, Gender, Beyond Determinism or Volunteerism. So she's thinking about the Trump moment and the idea that his base was devoted to the fact that he expressed himself in outrage, and that civility became suspicious because it was suddenly framed as political, as if politics, or let's say the symbolic, was shown to be fraudulent instead of shown to be the basis of civil society. And the irony that was the intolerance was shared actually, by Trump's supporters and opponents. And in her essay, she draws on Kristeva's notion of abjection to make sense of our contemporary preoccupation with victimhood and outrage. She examines and exposes the problematics of the fundamentalism of authenticity to diagnose and offer ways out of our current impasse, a moment in which the critical discussion and historical contextualization of identities and desires sometimes appear to be impossible. She takes on the culture wars and thinks about them, and thinks about victimhood in its unassailable fortress.
Yes, how somehow this which is called fundamentalism of authenticity has become to mean a protection from difference. And maybe that's also an issue addressed in the next chapter by Julie Flower McCannell, where she examines another iteration of our current disavowal of difference. And she reminds us of a phrase by Lacan that getting rid of sex marked the inaugural moment of capitalism. And via Lacan's recourse to group psychology, McCannell notes that Freud's observation that equality works by erasing difference, that everyone must have the same and be the same, that there is a paradox in this universality, this universal equality that is based on one exception. We can have equality because there is one exclusion, there is a one, capital O, that enjoys fully with no concern for his own absolute inequality in this regard with everyone else. So we have a very sharp critique of a form of capitalism that is anthrocentric. There is a male logic that strives and eradicates all traces of the feminine other logic.
Right. McCannell calls that sexual indifference, right?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of,
right.
We have only the part 3 left. Part
Sheila
3
Kavanaugh?
Of this collection, Being and Becoming
I see.
Trans.
I see.
Sheila.
Okay. Sheila Kavanaugh's essay. So in part 3, right? Being and Becoming. Tiresias and the Other Sexual Difference. Jacques Lacan and Bracha Edinger. Right. It's an attempt to revisit Lacan's choice of a trans figure, Tiresias, from classical myth, the blind seer who lived both as a man and woman, and who Lacan elects as psychoanalysis patron saint. This choice highlights an ethics of sexual difference that transcends originarily the gender binary, pointing to enjoyment beyond identification or beyond pleasure, responding to the question of jouissance. And Kavanagh elaborates the theoretical implications of Lacan adopting this trans mythic figure, linking feminine sexuality, the other jouissance, to the psychoanalytic theory itself. She then puts this in like discussion with Bracha Edinger's idea of the matrixial, which takes the uterus not as an organ, but metaphorically as a place of relationality and difference, what Edinger imagines as a site alternative to the phallus. This hybridization that Kavanaugh works on transcends gender, sexual orientation, and sexual morphology, and has potentials for both feminist and trans discourse.
Which is, yeah, I think one of the ethos of the book, this the rethinking psychoanalysis, gender, and sexuality with the contributions of trans discourses and practice that have radically questioned and redefined what it means to embody gender, confirming as well psychoanalytic findings about the imbrication of body image, language, and psyche. And here we see how in the collection we are returning to both the power and the radicality of the foundations of psychoanalysis, as well as recent theorizations in the field as a mean to rethink what it means to have a sex body. And of course, feminism has made use of psychoanalysis precisely because the body in question is always the body politic, affecting not only women's bodies, but other bodies as well. And it's important maybe to overcome what has been a transphobic stance. And this is one of the contributions that the next chapter does, Oren Goslan's chapter, Indifference, Feminism, and Transgender in the Field of Fantasy, where Goslan claims that the trans body is a new feminist body participating in a new body politic, and calls for a cooperation rather than a division between feminist and trans discourses. That for some feminists, the trans person's appeal for inclusion is taken as potentially obliterating women's rights to safety and stability, but underscoring the fragility of gender in order to traverse political and personal fantasies. Goslan returns us to the feminist founding credo of the personal is political, and shows in his essay that the trans person, for the trans person, the political is also personal, and argues for a space of indifference that allows for the toleration of ambivalence, permitting us to hear the other's desire as enigmatic, and a position of what he calls an ethical indifference. And this is how we move on to the next chapter, that is in dialogue with what has been a discourse partially constituted by psychoanalytic thinking, which is feminist thinking, and this is the contribution of Anjana Khanna, chapter 13, Translation Geschlecht, that follows Derrida's consideration of the term Geschlecht or gender, that, as Derrida leads Martin Heidegger, also asks what it means to think trans, to think across. And Khanna makes use of the construction, this rhetorical method of criticism, to reveal implicit assumptions, relational qualities of meaning, and textual tensions that are constitutive of any narrative, and as well loses the constraints of what had become psychoanalytic ready-made, such as anatomy is destiny or the woman does not exist.
Right. And what's exciting also about that essay is that it's underlining the trans in translation and what's untranslatable. So it goes back to a kind of resistance in language itself that's useful to think about, especially as we put these discourses in discussion. Yeah.
And reminding us that psychoanalysis from the very inception has been a transnational movement, that there is always a dynamic at play in psychoanalysis of a great interrelatedness with sex, race, lineage, nation, that are not only relevant for psychoanalysis, but also for the production of gender and the political implications of this construction.
And following
so,
the
yeah,
yeah,
following
following the political trajectory, in the next essay, Dina Al-Qasim discusses scenes of self-conduct in contemporary Iran, transnational subjectivities knitted on site. She discusses the emergent subjectivities between same-sex players and transsexuals under modern Iranian biopolitics, using Laplanche and Foucault, thinking about non-normative living in Iran today, and also thinking about using Foucault to think about transsexual experience as a contemporary reworking of spirituality. She then shows that transphobia and notions of sexual deviance are not limited to Western culture, but pervade socially conservative and religious ideologies globally. So segregation and abjection confront not only non-binary expressions of gender and sexuality, but concern day-to-day politics, day-to-day public bathroom politics across the globe, which takes us into our next essay. Patricia?
Yes, this is a critique of gender segregation and its concomitant threat of breakdown in meaning, and I'm talking about the next chapter by Calvin Thomas, Lacanistas in the Stalls, Urinary Segregation, Transgender Abjection, and the Queerly Ambulant Dead, where Calvin Thomas uncovers the psychic roots of the potentially murderous transphobic logic that permeates socially conservative ideology, that when we need to satisfy the most basic and urgent need and use a public restroom, we also use language or Lacan's symbolic order, and we are forced to make a choice of meaning either as a woman or as a man. And these so-called laws of urinary segregation impose a distinction on otherwise identical doors that also bring us echo, and this is part of the brilliant analysis of Calvin Thomas of what Kristeva ascribes to the abject. That is something, a transgressive instance is neither subject nor object, and we'll explore in this chapter who dares to be and to mean as both man and woman, and exploring these notions of abjection. Thomas argues that the cross-identified subject threatens bounded heteronormative notions of privacy by erasing hygienic lines between properly socialized sexualized bodies and the ungendered bodily expressions that are deposited on the other side of any bathroom door. And that's a critical reading of the film V for Vendetta, the 2005 film written and produced by the Wachowski transistors, analyzing the transcultural imaginary as a queer, counter-normative, or even terrorist celebration that takes distance from transphobic readings, imagining a less abject future. This idea of a future is a projection that we see in the next chapter that help us understand the complex forces constructing our present, as well as the narratives that allow us to build the past to be able to send us onto this perspective of a tomorrow. And this is chapter 16, Daily Novus, Becoming Being, Chance, Choice, and the Troubles of Transcursivity, that pursues an original perspective by examining the socially conservative ideology that we have seen taken to task by the trans experience. And Novus situates the popularization of a certain trans experience as a symptom of contemporary neoliberal economics biopolitics. The next chapter in the collection also explores the trust in the notion of authenticity, and questions this notion of authenticity in some trans narratives. For instance, when the trans narrative is described as becoming what one has always been. And this is chapter 17. I don't know, maybe you, Manya, want to sum it up. The chapter by Elena Comey del Junco, Just Kidding, Valerie Solana Scam, and Andrea Longshoes Female.
Right. So Elena Comey del Junco explores the implications of Andrea Longshoes' reductio ad absurdum, quote unquote, everyone is female and everyone hates it. She kind of gives a comedic stride and goes after the truth behind the joke. So instead of the Oedipal narrative, she takes the shortcut, which is comedy, and she kind of allows us through comedy to think about the problems of gender and the binary. As Chu puts it, things can get worse. We are all men and women, cis and trans, female. And then she discusses astutely the success and fragility of this argumentation, as well as the perils and pitfalls of such a philosophical joke. Lacan's famous exhortation, don't give way on your desire, has often been misinterpreted as a moral injunction not to give way on one's jouissance. And so this chapter makes us think about those ideas in a new way that opens them up.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was, in the interest of time, reaching the last chapter in our collection, that is the beginning of maybe a second volume, because it's a chapter that is questions that often in the assessment of transgender experiences and embodiments that clearly challenge the fixity of the binarity of sex, the narratives of an authentic gender, that often what hasn't been examined is that these tenets, the duality of sex, the nuclear family structured by the heterosexual couple, the primacy of sexual difference, that often these constructions have a repressed component and disavow component, which is the repression of the histories of coloniality that are buttressed in these constructions, and the overriding structural whiteness. And this is the last chapter in our collection, a very rich chapter by Yannick James, chapter 18, Transgender Quarrels and the Unspeakable Cisgender Whiteness of Psychoanalysis. This chapter rejects a conception of gender perceived as self-identification and proposes to address gender and race in parallel as two elaborations of embodied patterns of behavior. And raises the issues of race embodiment that are implied in transition, and in this essay, in necessarily interpolating and neglected intersection. And by this, I mean the neglected intersection of gender and race, that is an intersection that is over-determined by the implicit normative whiteness. As concern for social justice have loomed larger in the last years, we feel that such investigation is only beginning a larger set of inroads that we reserve, as I said earlier, for perhaps a second volume. But we concluded this collection with this very rich contribution that explores the exclusion of race, and in that, by addressing this, is unsettling this our constructions about gender, sex, and sexual difference, and is precisely addressing this intersection that is in the title of our book, Psychoanalysis, Gender, and Sexuality. I don't know if you want to add.
So we end with the possibility of another volume.
Yes. More.
Hell yeah.
More effort, right?
Well, thank you both for being here. I've read almost all of the essays, and I can't recommend this book enough. It's so good, and it's clearly such a labor of love and desire. and it's a really important contribution to the fields.
Thank you, Vanessa.
So, well, we thank you, and we wish to have ended, Vanessa, with reaching the happy ending.
Happy ending, our happy massage ending.
Yes, like in fairy tales, comedy, or massage parlors. An ending that maybe would ask for more if we gather the energy. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Bye,
Thank
everybody.
you.